One of the most interesting things happening in Hollywood right now is not just the success of Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey, it is why it succeeded. Because before this movie came out, there was a very strong possibility that it could have failed. And I don't mean a small disappointment, I mean a massive failure. A Christopher Nolan movie, a movie reportedly made on a budget of hundreds of millions of dollars, a 3-hour epic based on one of the most famous stories ever written. And yet, before audiences even watched it, the conversation around the movie was already extremely negative. Now, compare that with another major release, Supergirl, James Gunn's Supergirl, because Supergirl and the Odyssey are interesting to compare. Not because they are the same type of movie, no, they are completely different. One is a superhero movie, one is a mythological epic, but both have something important in common. They were two of the most criticized major movies this year before audiences actually experienced them. The question is, why did Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey overcome that criticism while Supergirl could not? Because the biggest lesson here is not about movies, it is about product, it is about brands, it is about perception. Every product has two perceptions. The first perception is the perception people have before they interact with the product. The second perception is the perception people have after they interact with the product. And the second one is usually the one that decides the future of that product. You can have the greatest marketing campaign, you can have celebrities promoting your product, you can have millions of people talking about your brand, you can create incredible anticipation, but eventually the customer has to meet the product, and when that happens, reality enters the conversation. This is something I have talked about before when discussing spectacles. Spectacles is one of the clearest examples of how powerful pre-release perception can be and how dangerous it can become when the actual product does not match the expectation. People wanted it, people imagined the future around it. The problem was that the perception was built around an idea, not necessarily the final experience. When the product eventually reached consumers, the excitement dropped. The product did not create the same emotional connection people had imagined before launch, and that gap between expectation and experience is where products die. This is why companies must listen to their audience. This is why the principles behind lean startup matter. You do not just sit in a room surrounded by people who already agree with you, create something, spend millions, and then force it into the market. You build, release, test, listen, improve. The audience is not your enemy. The audience is your feedback system. The smartest companies understand that customers are consistently telling you what they want, what they dislike, what they are confused about, and what they are willing to pay for. The mistake many brands make is that they believe listening to the audience means surrendering creative control. It does not. It means understanding reality, because reality always wins. And that brings us back to The Odyssey. Before release, Christopher Nolan's movie had one of the worst pre-release perceptions of his career. And that is saying something, because Nolan movies attract global attention. Even criticism against Nolan happens on a global scale. The trailer reaction became a major conversation. When people disliked what they saw, the dislike ratio became a talking point. The internet had already started writing the obituary of a movie that had not even been released. That is one of the funniest things about modern entertainment. People do not review movies anymore, they review trailers. One of the biggest controversies was around casting. Lupita Nyong'o's casting became a major discussion point because of the role she was reported to play as Helene of Troy. Helene of Troy is one of the most famous figures in Greek mythology, the woman whose story is connected to the phrase, the face that launched 1,000 ships. For many critics, this was not just a casting decision. It became a larger debate about Hollywood representation, historical identity, and whether studios were respecting certain cultures while changing others. The backlash became intense. Then there was another controversy involving Elliot Page. Rumors and speculation around his involvement created another wave of criticism alone. Many people reacted strongly before the movie came out. Memes spread, arguments spread. The internet did what the internet does best. It created a battlefield before anyone had even entered the stadium. And this is where the business lesson becomes interesting, because despite all of that, when the movie finally arrived, the conversation changed. Sort of. The audience met the product, and suddenly the product had to defend itself. Not the trailer, not the casting announcement, not the internet arguments. The actual movie. And this is where Christopher Nolan did something very important. He did not remove those conversations, he did something more difficult. He made sure those conversations did not become the entire product. Now, that is the difference. A product can contain controversial elements without becoming a product about controversy. That is what happened with the Odyssey. The representation discussions existed, but when the audiences watched the movie, they discovered that these elements were not the entire experience. Lupita Nyong'o's role was not the entire movie. The audience did not spend 3 hours watching a film built around one casting decision. It was one part of a much larger story. The same thing applied to Elliot Page's role. It was not the foundation of the movie. It was not what the entire narrative depended on. The controversy existed before release, but the actual movie was much bigger than the controversy. And this is where balance becomes extremely important. A great product does not necessarily make everybody agree, right? That is impossible. A great product creates enough value that different people can find something meaningful inside it. For the people who wanted representation, there were elements they could connect with. For the people who wanted a traditional mythological epic, the foundation of the story was still there. For people who were concerned about certain modern interpretations of masculinity, those themes existed. The movie explored ideas around power, relationships, and gender dynamics. The character played by Charlize Theron became part of those conversations, but again, it was not the entire movie. It was just one layer. The movie was not reduced to one argument. It remained a story about a man trying to return home, a story about family, a story about survival, a story about loyalty, a story about human nature, and that is why balance matters. The movie gave different audiences different entry points. Then beyond all the debates, people had to judge the actual filmmaking, and that is where the product defended itself. The Cyclops sequence became one of the most praised parts of the movie. The horror elements, the tension, the way Nolan approached mythology with a darker and more grounded feeling. Even people who had doubts about the movie acknowledged that some parts were extremely well executed. Visual effects also mattered. The scale, the giants, the world building, the cinematography. Were there criticisms? Of course, a movie of this size will always have criticism, but there was enough quality that even critics who expected failure had things they respected. Then there was the acting. A great cast does not automatically create a great movie. We have seen expensive movies with famous actors fail. A famous name cannot replace a good product. Sometimes Hollywood behaves like a person who found a successful business and thinks the only secret was the logo. They ignore the hard part, the values, the execution, the reason people cared in the first place. It becomes people loved the original, so let's make another one. That is not always a creative strategy. Sometimes it is just a financial strategy wearing a creative costume. That is why the live action Moana conversation became interesting. Many people questioned whether the motivation behind it was creative necessity or simply an attempt to extract more money from an already successful property. And when audiences sense that, perception changes because people are not stupid. Customers understand when they feel like they are being treated as a wallet instead of an audience. You cannot just put nostalgia into a machine and expect billions to come out. Sometimes the machine says, error, creativity not detected. The difference with the Odyssey is that people felt there was a product there. There was effort, there was craftsmanship, there was something to discuss beyond the controversy. And that brings us to the biggest branding lesson: build a good product. That is the lesson. Whether you are safe or controversial, the product must be strong, because great products can survive things that would destroy weak products. Look at personal brands. Some of the biggest names in history have faced controversy. Athletes, musicians, business people, public figures. People have criticized them, people have questioned them, but when they perform at an undeniable level, the value remains. There is always that person in an organization who is difficult. Everyone complains about them, but when the biggest problem arrives, everybody says call that person. Why? Because value matters. The same applies to footballers, the same applies to musicians, the same applies to businesses. A controversial person with an incredible product can survive, but a weak product with perfect marketing eventually gets exposed. A restaurant can have questionable reputation, questionable presentation, questionable everything, but if the food is unbelievably good, people will still return. Human beings are complicated. Sometimes our opinions fight our experiences. We say one thing publicly and then quietly return because the value is undeniable. It's like the millions of people still listening to R. Kelly's music. That is the power of a great product. So the lesson from Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey is not that criticism does not matter. It matters. Audience perception matters. Listening matters, but eventually the audience meets the product, and when that happens, the product has to speak, because before release, people judge what they think you created. After release, they judge what you actually created. And that second judgment is the one that builds brand. Follow me for more content like this, where I break down big brands, both personal and business, and then extract from them lessons that you can apply to your own brand. Subscribe to my channel right away.